Good morning, everyone. So lovely to have you here. We're going to get cracking. I know there will be some more people joining as and when, but this is such a big subject that I really want to dive straight in and hear as much from Kat as possible. Just a brief introduction for Kat. Kat Lister is a journalist of many years, and she and I work on basically all of the same publications. She writes for, she has written for Stylist, Vice, The Times, The Guardian, The Pool. We've known each other for a number of years, and I've read this book, and wonderful it is too. It's called A Widowhood, The Elements of Widowhood, and we'll talk more about that and the story behind the name in due course. But it's fantastic to speak to Kat today. I've spoken to her many times on this subject, and I really think you'll get a lot out of it. We're going to be talking about hope and meaning. Kat is almost 5 years down the line from the tragic and extremely premature death of her husband, who was also a journalist, a music journalist, Pat. We're going to speak to Kat in a sec about some context around that before we dive into the bigger themes. But I just wanted to let you know that if you have questions along the way, please do put them in the Q&A box, because I've ring-fenced some time at the end to have a look at those and put those to Kat, because I know that she speaks all the time to people in her situation who are maybe a little bit less far down the road. And so I know she'll want to get to those questions. So please do put them in the Q&A and we will come to them. Kat, hello.
Hello. Good morning.
So lovely to see your gorgeous face again.
It's been a while.
It has been a little while. And it's been a while for you since post-apocalypse, I think it's fair to say. I think it's important, before we start exploring some of the themes, that we have some context about the situation you found yourself in more than 5 years ago now, close to 6 years ago. What looked like and what your kind of journey was in terms of the events that unfolded.
Yeah, sure. So I was quite young when I met Pat. We initially met at NME when we were working there together in the mid to late noughties. And it was one of those things where we sort of like crossed paths but didn't quite match. And then about a year or so later down the line, we met at a party and started dating. And for about 3 years, we were just doing the things that every young couple do. And one evening, I had it was a text message from him actually to say that it was a Sunday afternoon, late afternoon. He had woken up after what he thought was a nap, with bruises all down one side of his face and down his body, and he didn't know how they had got there. And he went to A&E, and some rudimentary CT scans revealed that there was a large tumour that had been growing for some time actually, and he was eventually diagnosed with a mixed glioma brain tumour, and for those who don't know what that is, it's a sort of, can be a mix of high and low grade, very difficult to manage, lots of unknowns and lots of uncertainty, and for the next 6 years we lived in that uncertainty, not quite knowing what was going to happen, and how things were going to progress. Eventually, after those 6 years of living with this illness, the tumour morphed into a glioblastoma brain tumour, and I'm sure some of the audience members will know that that's the most aggressive brain tumour that you can be diagnosed with, and we had 6 weeks from that diagnosis to the point in which he passed away. So it was a very long, protracted illness, and then a very, very short period of time where things rapidly altered, and he died in 2018. So as you said, 5 years ago now, or coming up to 5 years.
The book explores grief, but what I love about the book and what I think is so powerful about the book is that it's not a hacks book, it's not a tricks book, it's not even a book of answers, it's just a book of experience. So why did you feel it was necessary to explore the themes of grief in a book. How did you feel grieving people were underserved by what was out there?
And we've had many conversations about this, but when Pat died, I became a voracious reader. I read a lot. Within the first couple of weeks, I started looking for voices, narratives, other people who had been through something, if not the same, similar, that I could connect with, that I could try and understand this incredibly distorted vortex that I found myself in, where time just seemed to have been it's expanded and contracted and stretched and snapped, and I didn't know where I was. I didn't know who I was. I felt like my identity had just been completely stripped away, and I began to sort of lose myself in books. But increasingly, over the time that I was reading, I realized that the narratives that I was absorbing were told from the perspective of authors who were a lot older than me. And whilst there was crossover, there were certain things that I was experiencing that I wasn't seeing reflected on the page that I was reading. And I started writing very early on, around the same time that I was reading. The first piece that I wrote was for a women's website called The Pool, where Sali Hughes also wrote for. And that was incredibly soon. I think back now to when I wrote that, and I have no memory of doing it. That's the first thing I should say. It was about 6 weeks after he died, and I sat down and I just wrote this essay. It was published, but it dealt with it dealt with all the themes that are in this book. It was a very visceral piece of writing, very raw, very much in those early weeks, in that sort of swirling, the swirlingness of the sort of the ripples and the eddies and the flows, and so water was a very important element for me from the very beginning, because it's intangible. Like you can't ever grasp hold of it. It runs through your fingers, and that's how grief felt to me. I knew that I wanted to write this book from the moment that I came up with the title. So I came up with the title before I even knew what I was going to write, because the elements became a thing for me. It was a way for me to explore these very extreme feelings and symptoms I was experiencing. And the book deals with that. So it's the relationship between mind and body and how those two interact when you're grieving. Again, I hadn't read an awful lot that delved into that, the physicality of grief, and how it can really subvert you, in the sense that you kind of feel like you're like a ventriloquist dummy. It's like you're being operated by this thing that's so much larger than yourself, that it can feel frightening, and you can feel like you're going mad. I'm very honest in the book. You know, there were points where I thought I had all sorts of things that were wrong with me. I thought I had MS because I was having all these very physical symptoms that made me feel like I was actually ill. The illness was actually grief. That's what
the physical body is what had put you in this dreadful, unthinkable position anyway. The body of your husband had let you both down. So I would imagine that in itself causes an odd dynamic with your body, that physical ill health is the very thing that has proved so ruinous.
Yeah, you've left with this shell of yourself that you have to fill back in again. And it was very hard for me to do that because I started dating Pat when I was 25. He died when I was 35. So most of my adult life was spent and was formed alongside somebody else. He was this very, very large, important person in my life, who I trusted and respected and looked to for guidance. And suddenly he's just been, snatched away from me, because a lot of the time language with loss, it doesn't match how you feel when somebody dies, in that, you haven't lost them, you don't lose someone like you lost a wallet on the pavement outside. He felt wrenched away from me.
Yeah.
And that was a very alienating, isolating thing to happen at a young age. And so part of writing this book is to ask that question of how one can possibly reconstruct themselves when something so traumatic has occurred and you've witnessed something so violent. At the time I described it as obscene. There's like this obscene thing has happened. And I have all these memories and they're still here. But how can I strike that balance of staying true to my past and those memories, but also trying to sort of, grow new shoots? How? So the book is the how. And like you say, Sally, I don't answer any of the questions in a very straightforward way, because I don't think grief is a straightforward experience, and I'm still learning. I think it's important to underline those question marks and to say it's okay not to know and to feel your way. It's trial and error. Sometimes you make mistakes. It's a messy thing. And that's what I wanted to communicate to others, is that, it is rough, and it is a strange thing to kind of wrestle with. But ultimately, as the theme for this festival is hope, despite all of that, there's a lot of light in this book, and it's me trying to find those shards of light. And so you're kind of on that journey with me to try and do that. But hope is it regularly pops up in my book for a reason.
I agree. The book is not, the book is visceral and tough and rough and all of those things, but it's not a depressing book. It really, really isn't. And I'm not saying there's not room for depressing books about death, because that's also necessary, but it's not that. There is lots of light in there. And I wanted to explore that idea of hope with you. This sort of mini festival is focusing on hope and meaning in grief. And it strikes me, when I have experienced the death of people who have died very prematurely, which I have sadly a couple of times now, I found sort of hope as both my friend and my enemy. I kind of despise hope some days, because hope is the thing that that you're constantly telling yourself you have to retain hope, but on the other hand, you know that hope is leading you down a path that is not realistic and will not bear fruit, because somebody is going to die, somebody who doesn't deserve to die, who you don't want to die, as you rightly say, is being wrenched from you. And so I was wondering how your relationship with hope during this protracted, awful, scary illness was versus your sense of hope afterwards. What was the journey you went on with that emotion?
I mean, one thing to consider is the fact that Pat was the most hopeful person I think I've ever met. Incredibly optimistic, and had this incredible ability to hone in on that and focus on it in the most trying and horrendous of circumstances, where we just didn't know what was going to happen next. And over the course of those 6 years, we had a lot of consultants' appointments where it was said that he didn't have long to live, and then something would happen, and we would be given a little bit of hope that there might be a new medication that he could take, or okay, there's a different kind of surgery we can do, which kind of bought us time, but it never solved the problem that there was this inoperable section of tumor that it just could not be removed, and it would morph at some point. So I think over the 6 years that we dealt with this condition, I witnessed that, and I saw him deal with his illness in an extraordinary way, that when he died, it was almost paying tribute to him to try and hold on to that, to harness his hope when I didn't have any. I would think back to moments that seemed so dark, where he seemed to be able to do that. And I tried to copy him. And so at the beginning, it was copycat. It was copying him. And then slowly, as I was sort of finding my balance in myself, and actually trying to wrestle with who I was without him, I managed to find my own hope within myself. And that's been the transition, which can sometimes be quite painful because it feels like you're slightly moving away from that person as time goes by. But in the beginning of the book, I mention hope within the first few pages, and I mention Emily Dickinson. I mean, I mention a lot of authors and writers and poets and thinkers in the book because it's important to get lots of different experiences and pack it in. But Emily Dickinson has written a lot of poetry on hope, and there's the famous poetry line is when she says, "Hope is a thing with feathers," which I'm sure a lot of you have read, which gives a very naturalistic and instinctive, idea of what that can be for us. But what I picked up on was another poem that she wrote where she actually called hope a strange invention, and it was the idea of the duality of hope is that on some days it can feel very natural, it can come to us in a very naturalistic way. Other times it feels like you're having to really search for it or force it. It feels unnatural. And I think this idea of hope being a strange invention in those early days of grief was how I felt about it, that it didn't feel like it was there for me to just find and utilize. I had to find it myself, and at times it felt like I was swimming against the current in order to do so. But I think it is a very multifaceted thing, hope. When we can sit here and I can talk about how that has evolved with me, especially over the last 5 years. It's not always there, and even now, I still have a lot of anger. I would say mainly about, in terms of what I've seen. We bear witness, don't we? If we've cared for somebody and seen them die, we are very passively borne witness to something that we couldn't change or alter ultimately. We could help as much as we can to be there for that person. But ultimately, we can't change what happens next. And I think that's what I struggled with at the time. And, on the days where I struggle with hope now and feel a little bit angry, it's how much he did suffer in those last few weeks, and how little I could do to affect change at that time, other than to comfort him and to make sure that he died as peacefully as was possible. So it's an ever evolving thing, I would say, and it's not always easy to grasp, and sometimes you have to mold it and shape it yourself, and that can feel quite tiring sometimes, I would say.
I think there's a degree to which hope also becomes something that's important to other people, that idea of kind of having to manufacture synthetic hope can often feel like an act of service to other people, which in turn can be frustrating and anger making. I think it's comfortable for people to feel that you are feeling hopeful and that you are looking to the future. Is there a degree to which you sort of want people to just bear witness to your hopelessness some days?
Yeah, and I think that's where sort of I've got quite a deadpan humor, can be quite sarcastic sometimes, and I played around with that a lot when Pat died, and that was almost a way of challenging my surroundings, and even my friends and my family. It was a way of me to see some kind of control, have some kind of autonomy, at a time when I felt like I had none, that I felt like for the last 6 years, we did the best that we could, and actually we had, you know, we had a good life together. Our relationship was strong, and we tried to make the most of what we had. But even saying that, is there's something missing. It's that, you know, as soon as this diagnosis occurred, you know, his condition impacted our lives in ways we hadn't anticipated. And, you know, it wasn't always possible to make decisions for ourselves. We had to think about a bigger picture. And actually during the pandemic, I think we all experienced some element of this, you know, that we weren't free to do the things we wanted to do, or make decisions that we wanted. And when Pat was ill, that was like a daily thing for us, you know, that it felt very kind of constricted, very boxed in. And so when he died, almost in a strange way, it's like all those walls of that box fell out. And then you're feeling very exposed to the elements. And actually, I think I felt a freedom in the carnage, that I could kind of do or say whatever I wanted to, you know, that there was like a no holds barred kind of, I could just express my grief in whichever ways I wanted, and I did. And that did feel a little bit liberating, I would say, in terms of previously I felt like I had to contain all of the time and sort of suppress everything that I was feeling and thinking, because I had someone else to think about. And also we were trying to maintain that hopefulness, to think that actually there was a way out of this terrible situation. And then the really terrible thing that you've been fearing for years and years, day upon day, actually happens. And so actually you have a bit of a fuck it, like, fuck it. The worst imaginable thing has happened. So what can hurt me now? Because my heart's broken, you know, no one can get at me now, because, you know, it's like the worst thing has occurred.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned about COVID, because of course I'm very aware that some of you present at this webinar will have experienced all of this stuff during COVID, would have experienced a sudden and traumatic and untimely death during COVID, while you weren't around people and not interacting with people. And that's a whole other layer, surely, of madness that has even yet to be explored as people kind of live with their trauma over that. You mentioned humor, and I really want to talk about humor. You are a funny person. Your husband was a funny person. You have written humorously about subjects that have nothing to do with this sort of level of trauma and grief, but you've also injected humor into your writing on this subject. And I want to read a quote back to you. It's always horrible when people read it.
Oh, what are you going to read? Go on.
It's happened to me a number of times, and I want to shut down, but I think it's important we explore this. You wrote in The Guardian, when you find yourself surreptitiously joking with your dead husband, the answer is pretty obvious: not much. In lieu of any rationalism, comedy can be a liberating tool in times of grief, a way to echo and mirror the absurdity of death itself. And believe me when I say it often feels painfully absurd.
Yes.
Let's start with that. Death as an absurdity. What do you mean by that?
Well, it just feels absolutely ridiculous. And I still have these thoughts now, so many years down the line, of how can somebody actually, can you see this plant? Can you see this plant that grows all the way across my kitchen? It's amazing. This plant is very special to me. I bought this plant when Pat was in the hospice. I'm very attached to this plant. I don't have pets. I don't have children. This is my baby that I've watched grow. How can this plant exist and have grown all the way across this kitchen, that Pat and I bought this kitchen together? And yet, you know, my partner and my mate has died. Things like that can kind of like kernels in your mind that can just kind of like start to sort of sprout in your head, because it does seem really ridiculous that they were both in existence at the same time, and now he's not here, but this thing is. And that's what I mean about the absurdity, is that whether someone dies suddenly or it's very protracted, like with Pat, I think that is the same, in that it can seem kind of crazy that they vanished almost. You know, the day after Pat's death, you know, the sun comes up, everyone gets up, they go to work, and this incredible, astonishing, beautiful person has gone. And you kind of have to, like, you know, figure out a way to, you know, carry on with your days afterwards, and try and mimic some semblance of everyday life. But, you know, you just do want to, like, pull down the blinds and stay in bed and just be in a darkened room. And over time, you know, that has obviously softened. But I do still have those days where, you know, and I still talk to him. I still joke with him sometimes, because, you know, like when you're in a couple and you have like your own little language, or little, like, you know, things that you say to each other, and little jokes, you know. And sometimes I will be reminded of a joke that we had, and I sort of have a little laugh with him in my head. And I sometimes wonder, you know, is he here? Is he around me? Can he hear me? Can we still communicate? I have no way of knowing, but what I do know is that like, I carry him in me, and you know, the conversation is ongoing, and I think it will be for the rest of my life. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And if we're talking about hope, you know, I often describe Pat as the air. Again, we're going to go back to the elements, and this is what I mean, is like that, it's that the elements are the best way that I can talk about Pat and grief for me. Is that he is the air around me. And, like, you know, some days, you know, on the bad days, it can feel like a real gale, and I'm sure we've all experienced that, where you feel knocked off your feet. Other days it feels quite gentle, quite reassuring. Other days I can barely feel the wind at all, and I feel guilty. I feel guilty that it doesn't feel like that gale anymore. And that can be very hard to deal with as time goes by, because you'll get more of those days where it feels very gentle, and it feels like that person is maybe drifting too far away from you.
Yeah, there is, I would say, the most, you know, we really focus on grief as this overriding emotion, as though it is an explainable emotion anyway. But actually, very often, the emotion that takes you through the days, hours, weeks, months following someone's death is guilt. It creeps into everything. Guilty that you're having too good a time, guilty that you're having a laugh, even when sometimes the laugh is just you seeking some kind of emotion to feel, to make your body feel and react. But guilt follows you around everywhere. And I wanted to talk about a quote which I know affected you, or that you had admired very greatly. It's such an extraordinary piece. So Damien Lewis, the actor, following the death of his wife Helen McCrory, who'd been ill for a number of years, you highlighted this quote, which I thought was audacious and quite subversive. Damien Lewis says, they say that the first day of diagnosis of an illness that could be terminal is your first day of grief. You are in a state of semi-grief while the person is still alive, because there's always a sense that something might go wrong at any point. There's a hyper alertness, and you are incredibly present and charged at all times. You're on a sort of war footing. You've got something to deal with that. And that gives you great focus. Everything is going into making that person better. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he describes that as a fertile period. He says, well, death is oddly ecstatic. Along with birth, it's the ultimate act of life, and it brings this enormous energy to it. And you carry that energy around with you. However deep and profound your sadness, a new beginning always has an energy to it. And it is a new beginning when your wife dies and you're left on your own. Life has changed, so there's an energy to that. Now, I sort of gasped when I read that. I thought it was so sort of brilliant and brave when the world is wanting you to just kind of fall in a heap and sob. It's quite an audacious thing to say. And I was wondering why it touched you and why you had admired it as somebody who spent a long time in a heap crying, why that had impressed you and inspired you.
when I read that, I kind of gasped because I understood it completely. I gasped also because I was aware that if a person hasn't been through that kind of, and specifically with a partner, that kind of acute grief, one might read that and think that's it almost seems counterintuitive, or it goes against the grain of what we've been told grief is or should feel like, which is a lot of what I explore in my book. I tweeted it almost immediately because I feel like when he was talking about a fertile period and energy, I felt that very much when Pat died. Not perhaps when I wrote that, the first piece that I wrote, I mean, 6 weeks after he died, that was in a sort of, was strange. I didn't really know what I was doing. But there was an energy there. And I think I really hooked onto words and writing as a way to save myself, as a way to sort of lasso myself out of this deep water I was in. And over time, and quite quickly actually, there was an energy to that, in that it did sort of propel me out of that really, really deep, dark place. And I connected what Damian Lewis said. I think it's very radical. I think it opens up a dialogue in a way that I don't think we've always been this comfortable talking about death, dying, and grief in the ways that we are now. I think in the past we've been very traditional. We're scared of it. You know, I write in the book, you know, if hospices are tucked away, you know, in areas, in suburbs, where we don't see it that much. We don't want to see death. We don't really want to engage with it until it happens. The problem with that is that when it does happen, all these things and all these experiences and all the things that you've seen are left with you, and you have no tools to process that or to even try and understand it. And I think with interviews like that, and actually it's a very generous thing for him to say, I think it will help a lot of people. I think it will assuage a lot of guilt that some people have when a person dies, that they're grieving in the wrong way. They're grieving badly. They're having these strange thoughts that they, you know, feel like are either betraying the person that they've lost, or even that are at odds with this kind of like the purity of grief itself, that we feel like there needs to, that it's supposed to look and feel a certain way. And actually, as I've been saying, grief is messy and complicated and contradictory, and it pinballs. And, you know, it's been called a madness for a reason. And, you know, the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, as we know, it's not linear. It doesn't follow in that way. You can experience all those feelings in a, you know, 1 minute of your day when you're grieving. So I think it's important to acknowledge the idea even that one could even feel creative or have that kind of energy. You know, we talk about birth and death, you know, that kind of meets back. So to me, that made sense that he would say that, you know, having watched Pat die, that's a profound experience, that there is a pre and post. I will never be the same person again, witnessing Pat's death, and the weeks that he so gallantly and he was so dignified in those weeks, you know, and so I've harnessed that, and it's almost in tribute to him that I'm now seeking these creative projects, and I'm wanting to travel, and I'm wanting to make new connections with people, because, you know, it's out of respect for him, and his life and his hopes, his dreams, that I'm not just living it for me. He's with me too. So I feel like I'm taking him with me during all these experiences.
The problem with, referring to Damien Lewis's quote, the problem with opinions or feelings around grief that make people feel uncomfortable to hear is that they make people feel uncomfortable to express and share. And I think when you have a situation where people who are grieving and in the eye of the most traumatic time, if they are in a position where they're unable to share how they feel, then that is the very definition of kind of toxic and insidious, I would think.
And to tap into that, sorry, sometimes my thoughts are too slow. It's why I write. I'm not very good with these things. But I was thinking about this yesterday in terms of that quote. And there is a clarity one feels in your grief, as well as having that sort of very sort of blurred disorientation. And I was thinking, it's kind of like, you know, when you go to the optician and you know when they're trying to find the right glasses for you, and you've got the big glasses and the two different lenses, and sometimes one lens is a little clearer and then the other one gets really blurry. Okay, so that's for me a grief.
Yeah. Better, worse, about the same.
Yes. And you're seeing two things at once, and you know, and it's possible that these two things can exist at the same time, that you can feel incredibly lost and brokenhearted, and so the blurry one, and also you can have this, you know, in death we see things in a way that we've never seen before, in terms of internally ourselves and also the world, and our surroundings. These two things can exist at the same time, and I think that's what Damien was saying, and it's something that touched me very profoundly. And that acute eye that I have now, I almost like my third eye, it's my grief eye. It was never there before, and I notice things that I didn't notice before. You know, when Pat was dying, things kind of, in some respects, you know, things sped up, and it's almost like I couldn't control time. But in the pockets of a day that I had to myself when he was in the hospice, that I could maybe go to the park or just go for a walk, maybe just for like 15 minutes, everything slowed down. I noticed like the smallest of things. That's never left me. And I think one only appreciates and experiences that when something like that occurs.
You were not, if in the immediate eye of the storm when you wrote this book, you were pretty early on in your journey. We are now very sadly approaching the 5-year anniversary. I'm sure there's a feeling of dread, or at least trepidation about that moment, but I was wondering about your relationship with time, where you're at. How does that 5-year feel? Do you feel proud of what you've achieved? Do you feel positive about the future? Where are you at with time? Because I find that sort of time heals thing, again, is such a kind of pointlessly linear approach to anything, never mind grief. So I was wondering where you're at with that.
I think it almost feels like it's been 20 years, because, you know, Pat died and then there was the pandemic, and I wrote this book during the pandemic as well. So a lot has happened. I feel very changed. And sometimes, you know, we talk about the absurdity of death. Like I sometimes, and I'm sure everyone does this, and most participants here will have had this happen to them. They imagine a day if the person that you lost comes back for the day. I imagine sometimes if he came back for a day and we sat down together, like say we went down the pub, and I'd have to like tell him and fill him in on everything that's happened. Also, like, you know, he never witnessed this pandemic, you know, how do I explain everything that's happened in the world, but also in my life? Because I actually feel like I have done so much and felt so much that in some ways there's this distance between us now that I can't fill in, you know. I'm aware of it. And naturally, I think that's what should happen for me, for some sense of peace in my life. But I can't say it's always easy to understand. And in some respects, and I still get bad days now, or days where he's just more, you know, present in my mind. it can be harder now because of the time that's passed, and it's not so easy to talk about with friends and family, because you feel like maybe you shouldn't be having those days, that you should be on like a one level now, and as we all know, that just doesn't happen. It's just not how it works, and it can take you by surprise. But time for me is something I explored very much in the book. It's something I read up a lot about. I wanted to kind of try and understand different theories on time, because time just warped and snapped, and I couldn't make head nor tail of it. And so the more I read about physics and things, the more it reassured me that actually not even the top scientists, the brainiest bods on the planet really know how time works, not really. And this idea that actually it doesn't really exist, past, present, future. It's kind of like all kind of runs alongside one another. Reassures me in some respects, but the biggest strangeness is that I'm turning 40 in 2 weeks, and Pat died when he was 41. I was 35. There was a 6-year age gap, and when I turn 40, this is going to be my last year that I'm younger than him, and then I will become the same age as him, and then I will surpass him. And I have still, don't ask me any questions on this, because I haven't figured out how I feel about that. It's really weird. And I'm still formulating how I feel about that. But I'm sure lots of people connect with it.
Yeah, there are so many people in comments sharing such kind of valuable insights and sharing questions on their experience, which I'll come to in a moment. We were talking before this conversation about Vonnegut.
Yes.
This brilliant quote that it seems like such a hopeful quote. Shall I read it, or do you want to? Do you have it at hand?
I have it, yeah. So so it's a very famous book that I've only just read, and for anyone who's experienced grief, I think it's very profound, and it was unexpected, because I didn't expect him to explore grief and death and time in the ways that he does in this book. But to cut this story very, very short, basically this is a character where he's kind of become unstuck in time, so he kind of time travels and he goes all around. And one of the narrative strands is that he believes that he was, I think it's like he's sort of, he's been picked up by these alien life form this sounds mad, from a different planet. And they have a different way of thinking about time. And he's having a conversation with these people, and they live on Tralfamadore. And on Tralfamadore, like, time is not really a thing. And they don't understand why people are sad at funerals, because the person who has died still exists. They just exist in a past time that still is running concurrently to the present time. So they are still alive, but you can't engage with them. And I found that quite reassuring. And there was a quote here that I just found very moving, and I think might be helpful for some participants here. So I'll just read it. And he writes, "All moments, past, present, and future, always have existed, always will exist. It is just an illusion we have here on earth that one moment follows another." I'll read that again. "It is just an illusion we have here on earth that one moment follows another one, like beads on a string, and that once a moment is gone, it is gone forever." And I just, I thought about Pat when I read that, and I'm sure others listening will be thinking of their loved ones too. So I just wanted to read that out.
That's from Slaughterhouse-Five, and Sarah Radford has just shared that it was one of her late husband's favourite books. So that's
well, this is actually Pat's copy, and he actually underlined that. So these pencil marks, that's his. So I was talking about like a dialogue continuing. Yeah. I love reading his old copies of books, because every so often I'll see a little faint pencil line, and it's like we're just like we're crossing paths again, which feels really beautiful sometimes.
Yeah, that idea of the past always existing and coexisting with the present and the future is a lovely and comforting one, and true. I think there are some really amazing insights in comments, but also we have some questions. So this is from an anonymous attendee. I'm just 3 weeks into my journey. Oof. In my grief, I'm also finding that my memories include realistic about what I think probably realistic notions, ideas, there's a word missing, include realistic thoughts about what my relationship truly was, including not perfect in a number of aspects. And that makes me feel guilty. It also appears to be something that is not talked about in widow forums. Is this normal? I mean, that is such a truism, isn't it, about all sorts of things. So the idea that you are desperately missing somebody, you didn't want to die, but also acknowledging that things were in some ways not great, not perfect. I mean, that feels quite relatable to me. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. And I write about this a lot in the book, and I'm very honest in the book, that I had guilt that I wasn't always the perfect partner and carer. I lost my temper. Due to his brain tumor, elements were affected within him, his memory. I would sometimes, if I had to repeat myself sort of 3 or 4 times, I would sometimes snap. We're all fallible humans, and that realistic realism, what is real, what is not, what is imagined, is really important when we talk about this, because there is no realism in your grief, not really. And we're led to believe that when someone dies, everything is sort of remains in this sort of perfect sphere, your memories, the relationship that you had with that person. And very early on in my counselling, when I was grieving, my therapist told me to imagine taking those rose-tinted glasses off, because actually it was really affecting myself in my present day. Because also when Pat died, he was fairly well known and was eulogized and written about, and that was really strange, because I felt like in some ways, because he'd been eulogized, and everyone was sort of expressing their memories and ideas and thoughts on Pat, and I was still kind of bumbling about and running into walls in the everyday, and I felt like I was just every day was this just whirlpool of chaos, that I was making all these mistakes, and yet my late husband had almost been frozen in time, and I found that very difficult, in terms of sort of how I was behaving and what I was feeling, because there is no perfect way to grieve, there is no perfect relationship. Memories are malleable, they change, we rewrite them according to where we are in the present. This is what I mean about past present, the lines aren't so clear, and so when we are recalling memories, they are always subject to change, and therefore they aren't these very stable stories in our head. They adapt, and so I would say it's okay. It's okay to recall those memories of when you maybe had a rock, or he really pissed you off, or sometimes I just, recall little things that Pat did that it's just it's nice to recall those moments, because it recalls the real multifaceted person that you loved.
Yeah. Anonymous, I'm so sorry that this has happened to you. I mean, really, and that you're so recently bereaved. I'm really sorry this has happened to you, but I hope you're somewhat reassured by the many other people in comments who are a little bit further down the road telling you that it is absolutely normal to feel this way. Lots of people relating with the benefit of hindsight too. So I'm very, very, very sorry.
Can I also jump in? Sorry, I know, Sally, you're probably going to mention another question, but it's okay to feel angry as well. I think anger can feel like a hard emotion to control and to feel. But there were days where I actually felt angry at him, because I felt like that he'd abandoned me, that he'd left, and I was kind of left in this wreckage, which again is not like, that seems like a ridiculous thing to think, because he had no choice in the matter and he didn't want to go, but it did feel very close to abandonment sometimes, and the anger was there, and if you do feel that way, again, that is okay, that is natural, that is normal, that is just you trying to, like, process what's just happened,
to raise the shame stakes even higher.
always.
when one of my best friends died very young after a very traumatic period of illness, I wished people dead all the time.
We talked about this when I went on your radio show, and I was saying, like, when I was on the tube and I'd look around and there were, like, these group of lads, like, just being awful, it's just awful, but I'm like, why him? Like,
I would watch the news or something and I would see somebody being really, really awful, and I would think, well, why are you alive? You should be dead. And I would wish people dead all the time. For about 3 years, I would constantly see people and inwardly think, well, I'd like you to die and I'd like her to come back. Yeah. And I think essentially feelings are just feelings. You have to allow yourself to feel them. The only thing you should or can control is your response to them and your behavior. But you have to allow yourself to feel them because they're just your feelings. They are what they are.
Yeah, agreed.
Emma, my wonderful husband, aged 41, good grief, died 9 weeks ago today. I'm so sorry, Emma. I'm struggling with overwhelming, unbearable sadness and anxiety. It feels like months and months that he's been gone. He was my best friend. This is so hard to bear. I mean, can we talk about that anxiety? Because I know this was a feature for you. We've talked about this before. We know, I suppose there's a simplicity in sadness, right? As horrible as it is, we understand sadness. But this sense of anxiety is something that comes up a lot with people who are experiencing grief.
I still have it. So I very much connect with that person. And I understand. And actually, as time's gone by, I don't write so much about grief, but when I do, the last few times that I have, very naturally, without me realizing, the word trauma started to come up, to rear itself. And especially in the last year or so, I struggle with anxiety. I also have PTSD. So trauma has been a thing now that I've started to try and deal with, try and figure out, and I'm still on that path, to reassure that person who's experiencing the anxiety. It's a natural, I think it's a natural way of dealing with what has happened, because if you think about your brain and your body and the connection between the two, and I explore this a lot in the book, it does have its physical manifestations, and anxiety actually can feel very physical. And I still get it now, that because I was on a constant state of alert for so long, it's almost like I'm in a period of unlearning these patterns of living that I was in for so long. So anxiety is very much a part of my life, and I have developed ways to cope with it, and it's a lot better than it was. And so I want to reassure the person that it's not going to feel this intensely forever, although you feel like it will when you're in it. I understand that. You need to give yourself time. It's very raw right now. And I hope that you are able to find someone objective to talk to about those feelings. I found a very good counsellor, and I had to work on those, almost like rerouting those thoughts to help me in my everyday, because it has knock-on effects. Like, I also have OCD because I was so out of control of everything all of the time that now to check the hobs is now my way of reassuring myself that something bad isn't going to happen again, because my learned behavior is that something bad always did happen. So if you haven't read the book, I'm not doing a hard sell, but what I also mention a lot of other authors in my book that deal with that connection between mind and body. It is very real. You're not going mad. It is manageable. There are lots of people who have been through the same thing. I am going through the same thing now. And I hope that you will seek reassurance from reading, maybe.
I mean, there's a definite period when you are an open wound rather than a scar. And even if when you get to the scar stage, there is a weakness there, and there will always be a weakness or a vulnerability there, and there probably will be, you will not be an open wound forever. That's I'm so sorry, Emma, that's so recent. And I think we're probably really, really grateful and appreciative that you've managed to get on here today and share your testimony. Catherine, my partner died in 2018 too, from mental health issues and accidental drug overdose. I find that this is something no one wants to talk about. It's all secret and hush hush. Silence just increases shame, and none of it represents the caring, loving man that he was. How do I balance the loss of the loving, caring man with some of the awful difficulties and behaviors during the last year of his life? I mean, I think, although we're specifically talking about mental health and substance related death, I think it's a danger of lots of premature deaths that a person becomes defined by how they died, right? That a person's entire character is overshadowed by the nature of their death or the events leading up to their death, whether it is cancer, a brain tumor, substance abuse, depression, whatever it is. Can you relate to that, Kat?
Although our experiences are different, I can relate to trying to untangle oneself from certain memories. I have also a lot of unpleasant memories of Pat's deterioration, behavioural changes sometimes. A byproduct of Pat's tumour was he had epilepsy, and when we were trying to manage that, he would experience grand mal seizures. And one grand mal seizure, which I deal with this in the book, it became violent. He lost all memory of who I was. He was just like he was like the calmest, gentlest person. When he came to from his grand mal, he had like all memory had gone, and he thought I was an intruder, and he chased me out of the house. So in that respect, I understand how it feels to carry those memories, and when they don't quite fit in like a perfect jigsaw puzzle piece to the rest of the picture, and struggling with that. Again, it sounds to me very, it's still very raw. 5 years is not that long. It's going to take time to have enough distance to be able to see that sometimes it doesn't fit so perfectly into a bigger picture, but also that didn't define the person that he was. And on days where I do go to those memories, and that's kind of like linked in with the PTSD that I have, I try to sort of like remind myself of the other sides of him, or maybe align that alongside another memory that I have, to try and sort of just kind of take that step back. Sometimes it can feel like you just sort of you're very much in this one kind of snapshot of a more traumatic memory, and as hard as it is to try and find a way to step back, it's so hard in grief, I know, because you can be sucked into it.
Before people are stolen from you by death, they're also very often stolen from you by illness. And people with mental ill health, that can be a really, really long road. Sort of losing parts of somebody to mental ill health, but they are still the same person inside.
No, they absolutely are. They absolutely are.
There are 2 more questions left, because I really want to make sure that no one is ignored. I'm going to ask that no more questions come in, so that we can make sure that everyone who's been brave enough to ask one is answered. I want to go to Lisa. Is fear a prominent emotion in grief for anyone? I'm 4 years grieving after the sudden death of my husband. I mean, that in itself must be a very traumatic and shocking experience. But fear, Kat, can you talk about fear, and also perhaps people in comments? There's so much support and shared experience in comments. It would be interesting to know who else has experienced fear as a result of a death.
I don't know if you read C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, but that's how he wrote a memoir about his wife who died, Joy Davidson. It's a very slight book. He wrote it because he was wrestling with his Christianity when she died. How can I believe in all the things that I have when this person suffered the ways that she did? He opens up saying, no one told me that, I'm paraphrasing, but nobody told me grief feels so much like fear. It is actually a very normal, natural response to have. And I still have it now. Like sometimes I'll have days where I feel like I've got an exam due or something. Like there's just like this feeling kind of here in my pit of like, you know, something's not quite right, and something's not quite right because this greater thing has occurred, and this person is no longer there. So I you know, in my early grief, fear was very much a part of this medley of emotions that I was feeling, and it could be very unsettling, and sometimes it could feel very, very physical. You know, I threw up a lot. I felt very, very, very on edge, very anxious. Those physical symptoms kind of ebbed away as time went on. But, you know, I think that fear is connected with anxiety, what we were talking about before. Like all these things are all interlinked. And I would say almost like I've been left with a slight imprint of that acute grief that occurred even now, but the imprint is fainter now, and I think as time goes on, it's not necessary that any of this goes away. I want to reassure people. In a way, it is reassuring to know that, because I don't think it would be honest of me to say that at some point down the line, all this is going to go, and you're going to feel like the person you were before. It's just not possible. But what will occur is that you become more familiar, and you will feel more in control of those feelings. You will recognize when maybe you're starting to feel a little bit anxious and why that is. And therefore it will feel less rocky. It won't feel as, the peaks won't peak as high and as violently as they did before. It will still rustle a little bit, but I think that you will feel more in control of those internal thoughts and feelings and memories.
Absolutely. And as you say, it hasn't gone away. And I really don't want to wrap up this conversation in a neat bow, because that's not how grief works. But we are exploring hope and meaning. And so I wanted to ask you very finally, do you feel hopeful?
Yeah, I do. Actually, as you said that, the sun just streamed through the kitchen. And I remember the morning Pat died. I wasn't with him when Pat died, and that was a lot of guilt that came with that. But when I got to the hospice and I said my goodbyes to Pat, and I was in the friends and family room in the hospice, and it was about 5:30 in the morning, and the sun came up, because the sun does come up. And even on that, my darkest day, I was able to have a split second of seeing the sun come up, and feeling it. And so I would say, yes, I feel very hopeful. I'm proud of what I've made and written. I'm proud of the distance that I've come. And also, you know, like I said, I'm carrying him in me. So it's like, there's not a separation there in terms of like I'm moving so far away from him, because sort of I'm carrying him with me, and he's seeing and doing all the things that I am, because of that. So if there's any hope, surely there's hope there.
There certainly is. I just wanted to say thank you so much for the participants commenting. I'm sure lots of you wanted to comment and felt you couldn't, and that's also fine. It's generous of you just to be here on a Saturday morning. But for those who left comments, so insightful, so generous, so kind and perceptive. It's been a really fascinating conversation going on my right-hand side, which has been really lovely. Lots of people relating to one another and reassuring one another. And there's much more reassurance too in the book, which is called The Elements of Widowhood. There is a link in the chat box on how you can obtain it through Storysmith Books. Thank you, Good Grief, for hosting this really important discussion. And there are various events throughout the day, as I understand it, that will include lots more perspectives and insights on this really underserved, undercovered, I mean, what even is it? Maelstrom of emotions. And so I hope you will take part in those too. Thank you so much as ever, Kat Lister. Thank you all for coming.
Thank
and
you.
We're going to
thanks everyone for coming. It's I can't believe there's so many participants. It's been lovely to have you to share.
An amazing, amazing, amazing audience. Thanks, guys. And I wish you a really good weekend and rest of the day. Lots of love.